Hi everyone, and welcome to our breakfast seminar this morning on our global human rights eroding. We're very happy to have Hanne Sophie Greve with us today, and looking forward to a very interesting discussion with Elin Skår, Siri Gloppen, Lisa Rachner and Jackie Dugar afterwards. So thank you everyone for coming. If you would like to know more about the events that we have going on at the centre, please follow us on Facebook or Instagram or sign up for our newsletter. We have a lot of events coming up this week. So we have one this afternoon on Brazil and Norway and environmental disasters at 3 o'clock here as well. So it'd be lovely to see some of you there if you're able to make it to that one too. So welcome everyone, and I'll hand over to Siri to introduce the panel.
So thank you very much, Anna, and thank you to all the volunteers from the Centre on Law and Social Transformation who's been organizing this event. And thank you for coming. I'm very excited about this morning's event, and I was particularly appreciative of the way it started because Hanne Sophie Greve, who most of you will know, she's a judge at the High Court here in Bergen at Gulating, and a former judge of the European Court of Human Rights. So she sent an email to Lisa and me saying, I have something that I've been thinking about and writing about and that I would like to come and discuss. And that is so wonderful. And that is something that we really appreciate, because of course we want this space, Bergen Global and the Centre on Law and Social Transformation, to be a place where people come to discuss concerns of the role of law and rights in society and sort of how it operates, and to help us deal with really hard questions, which we're going to do today. So Hanne-Sophie will start by introducing her thoughts to us, and then we have this most extraordinary panel. Elin, sitting next to Hanne-Sophie, Elin Skår, she's senior researcher at the Christian Michelsen Institute and has been doing research particularly on the role of law in transitions from war and authoritarian rule, but also human rights issues more generally for your entire career, which is longer than it looks. Really. And the same is true for the ones that I'm going to be very rude. So the same is true for Jackie, that you also have a lot longer career than it looks. But Jackie Dugar is a professor of law at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, and also a sociologist first by training, and then a lawyer. So first a PhD in sociology, and then training in law, and also a background as a social activist. She was the founding director of SERI, the South African Centre on Socioeconomic Rights, and also ran the general office at WITS, and also so both an academic and an activist, and has written very recently on a very on similar concerns. So we're really happy to have you on the panel. Jackie is here, and a visiting scholar here at the Centre for the month of March. And then, last but definitely not least, Lisa Rachner, who is she's a professor of comparative politics, but she's also the head of the Rafto Prize Committee. And that's very sort of also practically and not only academically engaged in the issues. So we have a...
And also my career is very, very long. Much longer than
it doesn't look that
would you think.
Very true. So, without further ado, and now, yeah. So thank you all for coming. Thank you for joining us. And Hanne-Sophie, please, the floor is yours.
I would have to sit still, otherwise I might have gone to the window. It's not a good idea to throw things out of the window, and definitely it's not a good idea to throw people out of the window. Oh, you can turn my microphone on. Yes, that's mute. Maybe that's better when I speak about such things as throwing things out of the window. And actually throwing people out of the window is very bad. As you may recall, that was the opening of the 30 Years' War, the revolt in Bohemia, 1618. 3 local representatives of the emperor in Vienna was thrown out of the palace window in Prague. They fell into a heap of dung, so they didn't really hurt themselves. But there were 30 years of war subsequent to that. And every monstrous fraction in Europe joined that particular war. It was a gruesome, long, long war. Europe today is not stable anymore. I don't have to remind you of the financial situation in Greece, of the problems with Orban's Hungary, in Poland, with the Yellow Vests, with Brexit today and tomorrow, or yesterday, deep divides in the British society. And when we have also a wonderful representative from South Africa, one of my colleagues in the International Commission Against the Death Penalty, Navi Pillai, she was the former High Commissioner, UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. She recently addressed students in South Africa. They were in rebellion because they are very angry. They told her, human rights, what's that? We don't care. We don't care at all about human rights. And by the way, the color of your skin is wrong, the black student said, because she is of Indian descent. So again, things are coming up across the globe. And at the same time, most of the migrants who move around the world today are not persecuted in the traditional meaning of the word, but they are seeking different living conditions. They are seeking human flourishing and happiness, which should be for all of us to share. That's no question. But we have, in my opinion, come to a crucial moment in time where everything is that volatile that if we only consider human rights as we've done so far, without looking deeper at the questions, without looking at what they came up in response to, and how they are at the same time equally important today as in the past, we may have them no more tomorrow if we don't look also at other aspects of human living. And I would like you then to go back to some of the roots of all of this. For one, what is the human being? Why do we have human rights? The essence of human being is being, my being. That is, and your being, that is, life is not just one right among others. Life is the essence of the human existence. And second to that comes the issue that we have to recognize one another as human beings. It's you, it's me, it's the self-recognizing I recognizing the self-recognizing you, treating the other person, as a subject, never as an object. And these are crucial issues. They are underlying the issue of human rights, but we have to rethink them. The 3 Abrahamic religions, Christianity, Judaism, and the Muslim faith, share the basic understanding that in the beginning God created the human being. As man and woman, he created them. This short, you may believe it or not, but this short, be it by nature or be it by God or whatever, this short you may explain the very, very simple and complex issue of being human. Me and the plurality, the individual and the plurality. Everything is based on an understanding of the individual as belonging to a plurality. Actually, we were placed in the company of one another because we couldn't survive alone. Anyone who would think human rights is made for me is wrong. If that was the case, I wouldn't even be able to speak. To learn to speak, you need the company of fellow human beings. What is wanting in me, I may have through your assistance, and vice versa. So everything is really a relationship between the individual and the plurality. And then we may go back, in Europe at least, to Kant. Not that there are not explanations to be found elsewhere, but just for a starting point and not to be too long about it, we can go to Immanuel Kant or Hegel. And they will tell us that what it's all about when it comes to basics, it's freedom. And my freedom extends only until it meets with yours, and where it can be compatible with the freedom of everyone else. Freedom is what is only limited by the freedoms of others. And my freedom is not to go beyond your freedom. The revolutionary aspect of human rights is actually that we are all equal in dignity and worth. That was the outcome of the Second World War. Not this right, that right, this right, that right. Because they always had, among groups who recognized one another, be it man, be it free, be it white, be it belonging to this particular nation, they always gave one another what they thought due if they recognized one another. Equality, equality, equality is crucial to human rights. It's the core of human rights. Recognition of every human being. And if we give up on that, if we agree that women, people who believe something else, have a different color of the skin or whatever, are inferior in any manner, then human rights are gone. Then anyone could define anyone out, the others, outside, not to be shared with. We cannot accept that. That's the core value that we have gained after 2 world wars and so many other wars. And then comes the issue, what are the functions of a state? Human rights were introduced after World War II because the state had really trampled on people to the extent that life had no meaning, freedom had no meaning, personal integrity had no meaning. Nothing had a meaning. Human rights were introduced essentially to say, I, you, each of us have a right vis-à-vis the state. The state cannot kill me, the state cannot imprison me, the state cannot torture me, the state cannot stop me from speaking. This is fine. I don't have an equal obligation not to kill the state. I mean, I shouldn't do that, but still, it's a different issue. But when it comes to the relationship between people, and we should go back to European philosophy also in this respect. Go back to Aristotle. Look at what's a state. Why do we live in a state? We live in a state, we may go to the Chinese, Mu Tzu, in the Warring State period, early Warring State period. He said, to understand what society is all about, we can imagine a state of innocence. He used this concept that early, saying state of innocence where no one agreed on anything. I have my preferences, you have your preferences, and for this reason there will be strife and quarrel all the time. Society is there for us to prosper. Society is made up for us to advance. And that means that my freedom and your freedom to be compatible needs to be regulated by law. Social transformation comes through law. Law will be the implement to help people flourish, to have a situation in which we can be dependent on one another and independent, have a space in which we can be individuals and a space where we can always rely on the others. I can't fly. I mean, I can't fly the airplane. I can't be a doctor. I can't do this. I can't do that. There is almost nothing I can do but law and some practical issues. So I depend on everyone else. Society must make provisions, through law, for a flourishing society where I can prosper. This is what the world is moving around in search of today. But this is what Europe seems to be forgetting today. People feel that their life conditions are becoming more difficult. You have a privatization of many things that were more easily accessible in the past. You have the same financial system that was let loose in Eastern Europe after the fall of the Berlin Wall. It's now all across the globe. And it's dangerous, and it's difficult, and it causes social imbalances. It's only through balance, where everyone has rights and obligations. And in the context of speaking of human rights, we do not traditionally speak so much of obligations. But when it comes to my freedom meeting your freedom, there is no freedom without me respecting obligations. Obligations vis-à-vis you and the other ones. Every single individual. I cannot function at all as a human being, as an individual in the plurality, without recognizing my obligations as well. And we have to start speaking about them as well. I'm not suggesting to give up human rights. I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't speak about rights. I'm not suggesting there are easy answers to all the challenges we face today. But we face tremendous challenges. Also for one reason that technology is changing so fast. So very, very, very fast. And these are issues we have to consider. We cannot respond to an ever-changing world by the answers of the past. You are the future. You have to respond to the new challenges by creative new thinking. Thank you.
Thank you, Hanne Sophie. I want to give the word to the panelists, but can I just ask you a question, just following up? Because one implication of what you is one implication of what you're saying that, I mean, we've seen a sort of tremendous expansion of law internationally, and a tremendous expansion of the not least in Europe, of the significance of courts as bodies for resolving political conflict, not least human rights, the European Court of Human Rights. And so is one implication of what you're saying that there is a limit to how much we can deal with in this way? And that is sort of, is that one of the answers of the past that we need to rethink?
We need, in my opinion, to rethink how courts are functioning. What are their mandates? Even the Human Rights Court, in which I was a judge myself, I see it as becoming irrelevant if it doesn't limit itself to core issues and give more room for, or leverage for, specific societies and individual societies and different states sort of deciding more issues on their own. Also because financial differences, social differences, whatever, may provide for different ways of human flourishing. We have a number of states today saying that they would want to consider to withdraw from the European Court of Human Rights. And as I said, even the High Commissioner, former High Commissioner for Human Rights was told, forget it. It doesn't matter to us anymore.
Thank you. I want to start by giving the word to Jackie, because you've this is also related. You're taking cases to court, human rights cases to court. So this is also a sort of personal challenge.
Sure, thank you. I think that was a really fantastic way to start the discussion, and I think these are really the issues that we need to be thinking about. Last week on a panel I was talking about my concern about, which I'm sure everyone here shares, about the rise of fascism. And I think, and my partners always said to me, what we don't realize is that human rights is not a ratchet system. Maybe we thought you would get here and then that would be, we wouldn't be able to drop down. We'd always be moving forward. No, as it turns out, we can drop down. It isn't necessarily and automatically an upward movement. And I think it really is a challenge for us, and particularly for the youth, youther than us, to make human rights relevant. And as I was saying last week, or to find something that is more relevant. And in all the critiques of human rights, I'm not hearing people really talking about a viable alternative. And so I think that we really do need to work on the project of making human rights relevant. And Siri, I know your question is about courts, but I'd like to first just answer the answer that I want to answer, which is effectively that I think the real challenge today is it's what Nancy Fraser has spoken about. I think that the struggles of the 20th and 21st century so far have been struggles about recognition, and to a large extent, the struggles for recognition with the backlash around that. It's not to say that we've achieved gender recognition, sexual orientation recognition, racial recognition, etc., but there's been a lot of backlash nonetheless. But the struggles for recognition have to a large extent replaced the struggles for redistribution. And I think this is the fault line that we really have to focus on. And this is the critique that you see from people like Samuel Moyn, that human rights have failed in an unequal world to tackle inequality. And so I think that in the inequalities, the thing that we need to really focus on is socioeconomic inequality, class inequality, and how human rights can tackle that. And I think that for that, the courts need to be dealing with socioeconomic rights. We need to figure out how to deal with these issues within the terminology, for example, of the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. We still don't have clarity on what is maximum available resources. How should courts be determining this on a case-by-case basis? We need greater clarity on these things because these are the real challenges. And I would just end with one last proposal, which really comes from Nancy Fraser, that what we need to be doing, Nancy Fraser points to the kind of trap of recognition-related rights, that it sort of traps you. It's a conundrum because the more I feel oppressed as a woman, the more I mobilize around my oppression, is the more to reinscribe that oppression and victimhood. And this forms a bit of a trap. And Nancy Fraser suggests that the way out is not to reinscribe that victimhood or oppression as a woman, as a black person, as a Muslim, whatever, but rather to focus on the privilege, to focus on using rights to break the privilege and the supremacy, etc. So I think for me that is the real challenge, and to figure out how courts can assist in this role.
Thanks a lot, Jackie. Very, very interesting. And this, in many ways, also, I mean, Lisa, what I didn't mention in the introduction is that you're also heading a research project looking at the backlash against democracy, particularly in the African context, but also more generally. And this is also a backlash against, in particular, a backlash against liberal rights in many ways. So sort of from your perspective on these dynamics, could you just give
there are like many sort of ways in, so I've been sort of thinking about that. So I think I want to catch your phrase on balance, because I think that is the key. So from one of my perspectives is that as the head of the Rafter Prize Committee, we receive nominations every year, quite a lot. And sometimes at the beginning of the year, we have this almost like a bad joke. Well, we are not going to go out of business. There is enough misery in this world to go around. And what I want to say is that the submissions that we receive just tell us that human rights and international support and an international recognized system of human rights is more important than ever, and also maybe in waning supply. And that really, really concerns me. And so I think what we really, really need is more global human rights governance and not less. And so I heard you maybe saying that, you know, we should give more power to the countries and maybe less to the European Human Rights Court. I'm not sure that's what you said, but that's kind of what I heard. And so I just want to say that to me, this is so that was my human rights part, and then now as my scholarly part, this is where we are going, and this is the new politics. This is the Donald Trumps of the world. They want their countries to have more power. They want to go back in a sense, and it's really a kind of going back. They want to go back to when states decided everything. Before there was global governance, before there were global companies like Amazon and everything, just really making a lot of sort of state taxes irrelevant. But they want to go back to that system. But the problem from a human rights perspective with that system is that it's pitting states against states. It becomes kind of a zero-sum game. And it's also a system that's really hurtful for many, many minority groups. Because they become, again, I mean, I should maybe now have learned not to use the word victim, but they become still victims of states that are running on majority support. So if you are a gay person, or if you're a woman, or you know, a minority is kind of another minority. Women can never be minorities, of course, but then you are. The more these states take power over and say that human rights, international human rights norm are irrelevant, minority groups have no protection. And that is exactly what we are seeing in many European countries, like Hungary, saying, you know, so here's my point. What they are really reacting to is the European success story. They are really reacting to one of the things we don't talk about EU. We talk a lot about all the economic failures. We talk a lot about, you know, that they have commissions for deciding the size and shape of cucumbers, whatever. What we don't talk about is the enormous success of creating a European law and, you know, a European court. And that's kind of, and that is what these country governments are reacting to. I think that I'm actually very pleased with this success of Europe. And I think that this is probably maybe the best chance for having a kind of globally, in the sense of Europe, a protection of human rights that may spread to other continents. So I was, you know, where we agree, I think, on, you know, where we're worried about the status of global human rights, I actually think that we should say hooray to Europe. So that's like, I come in from
I have a comment
this
on
morning.
Yes, you can have, of course.
Just
Please.
a short comment on that. Of course, I'm not disagreeing with the success story of Europe, having created more of a common feeling and all of this. But if you look at the European Court of Human Rights today, it has not looked at Orban in Hungary. It has not looked at Poland. It has not looked at Turkey and Erdogan. And these are huge human rights challenges. But it does decide on whether you can build this far or this far from sort of the house of your neighbor in Sweden, for instance. So the court has a tendency. I really support the court and welcome the court, but the court has, like any decisive decision-making body, a tendency to look for the easy issues, and the small issues are frequently easier than the big issues. I welcome a court to decide also on the
big issues. And I think if it looks for the small issues to compensate for not taking on the big issues, it will become irrelevant. I am not in favor of a Trump version of my country being big, by no means. I think America is, the United States of America is an example today of where human flourishing for all is not permitted for. But I do see some kind of, again, a balance. Even when you look at virtue ethics, the virtue is always the balanced mean. And there is a mean between what should be organized internationally, although I think we can never feel too much connected to other people. I think feeling as one shared world is wonderful, but still we do have a system with states, and certain things can, in my opinion, be better organized for the time being within states. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to ask what so Elin, as I said, one of the things that you've been consistently looking at for many years is how do you use law to provide some in a context of transition, and then a lot of these issues come up. So, how much should we look at? What should be the focus of the transitional justice process? Should we only look at really gross human rights violations? Should we only use as physical violations? What type? What should be the focus? And so in a sort of, and that has shifted over time. So in a way, I'm just thinking that in this context, there is also a lot of considerations of what is going to deliver the better result. Sort of what is going to be, what is lost if we take a narrow or a broad focus, which is in a way the question that you're answering. So I would like you to sort of also sort of maybe share some of those reflections, because that is maybe the context where that is sort of most concretely decided on at present.
I'm just tempted to say, what do you think about this? But I think what you're touching upon is a central sort of dichotomy within human rights, which is what you can expect from the state refraining from, which is the state should not take your life, the state should not torture you, the state should not kill you arbitrarily, the state should not imprison you outside law, etc., etc. So that's one set of rights. So when you talk about gross human rights violations, we usually refer to those rights. And then you have another set of rights, which is the state should also provide you with certain things, socioeconomic rights, the right to water, the right to health, the right to holidays, the right to a living environment, the right to clean water, etc., etc. So if you look at transitions from authoritarian rule or from war to peace, I think most of the violations that have been the core focus are sort of the fundamental rights, torture, torture executions, etc., etc., physical bodily harm. But I think there has been a tendency over time to also include other kinds of rights. I was just reading the Brazilian Truth Commission report, and the right to your identity and sexuality is one of the recommendations of the report, which means that more recent transitions or more recent attempts at dealing with human rights violations also include other kinds of rights. So this is a shift that we see, I think, across the world. So in that way, it's optimistic. It's broadening the scope for human rights, but it's also making it more difficult, because the more you put into the human rights basket, the less likely I think you are to sort of have all rights for everybody at all times in all countries. And I think what I wanted to ask Hanne Sophie is actually, if you were going to define human rights for a student in this room who has heard about human rights, but who actually doesn't know what the content of human rights is, could you just explain that very briefly? Because you mentioned, I know this is a huge topic, but you mentioned the Second World War and how, the Declaration of Human Rights and all the covenants have come after the war. But if you talk about human rights as something which is inherent to you as a human beings existed long before the Second World War, right? So in a way, it's codified now in law. and covenants. But what does human rights actually entail? And further from that, what are the biggest threats now? You mentioned a whole bunch, but what are the biggest threats, not only in Europe, but I think globally? These are huge questions. I don't know if we can answer them in 2 minutes.
You've got to ask the chair if we have time.
No.
But I think we have to get to the essence of what we mean by human rights, if threats to human rights is going to make sense.
But this is, in a way, I think this is very interesting, because I think, well, this is what you've all been speaking to, and this is also sort of what, because what Jackie is saying is that if human rights are going to be relevant, we really need to look at the rights that affect socioeconomic differences in society and make them relevant to tackle those issues, because that is the foundation for inequality. And then you're saying, should we start with the core, and what should the core be? So this leaves you with questions on.
A short explanation of human rights, yes. Well, actually, being human is a special thing in terms of having dignity and worth. That has been recognized throughout among people considering themselves equals. Mm-hmm. When we break that understanding, we can hope for never again after World War II. If you look at what happened, with the Declaration of Rights for the male citizen in France, the woman who suggested it should be for women was equal in the sense that she could put her head under the guillotine, but otherwise she was not allowed to have the rostrum. The American Declaration of Independence actually was written by a man who had slaves, saying that everyone were born free and equal. So being human is special, dignity and worth and equality. These are the basics. And then for me, I take recourse to Kant, freedom. And I say, go back to Aristotle and say the state is for everyone. So there must be limits on the state. These are the basic human rights, in the sense that they threaten the life, and you can have the state refraining from taking my life, torturing me, etc. The other obligations presupposes that we create functioning societies where social cohesion, I forgot to mention that, is actually a core of the matter as well. Because only if we can create social cohesion and solidarity can we have actually food for everyone, water for everyone. Water, by the way, is not one of the universally recognized rights. Incredibly enough, they forgot about water, and now it's being privatized in many areas.
Jackie knows a lot about this.
Jackie, yeah, that. Lisa, do you want to have a comment?
So we really should talk about water, but I think that I really appreciate this discussion of going back to the core, because what is it that we have? But what we need, in my opinion, today, is much more global governance. We need global human rights to protect each and every citizen on this earth, and we need a kind of a universal protection. But we also need global governance to govern finance, to govern all the things that are not contained to states anymore. And there are so many things that are not sort of kept within the state borders. Information, so many things. And so I think what we really need is, in a sense, more global governance. And then I really, some of the things as a non-lawyer and not knowing, maybe it's because I'm so ignorant, that's why I'm so optimistic, That's probably, oh my God, that makes me like Trump. But but so my sense is one of the things, so I'm a political scientist. I work with elections, I work with social movements, I work with a lot of impatience. People are impatient. They want change and they are really upset about something that has happened to them. They want to change everything in an election or in a social movement, walking out in yellow vests or whatever you have. These are the kind of things that I work with, impatient things. So I've come to appreciate the slowness of courts. I've come to appreciate that these processes take long. And I think we need, and so I've been tearing my hair out. Hungary should be kicked out of the EU. You know, this country does not belong. They do not fulfill the Copenhagen Agreement, you know. And a lot of people agree with me, and we are, in a sense, right along a number of dimensions. But there are great things about this thing taking a long time. There are great things about Hungary not being kicked out. There are great things about something that slows down bad political times and impatience. Because that, you know, Hungary being kicked out of the EU would be even worse for minority groups, would be even worse in the long term for those of us concerned with democracy in Hungary. And so, yes, it's bad. It's, you know, what they're not doing in Poland, what the EU is not doing in Hungary and with Turkey, all that is, but it's not, there are processes, but the fact that they're taking much longer than my anger and than the protest movements and the political processes, there's something inherently good in that. And so I think the fact that there are some processes that are slow and that don't move on 5-year cycles, I think that is something we, as human beings, really should appreciate. And now I sound old. Huh?
So I think that one of the things that I've begun to realize is that part of the problem is, a big part of the problem is patriarchy, and that we really do need to work harder on ecofeminism. Effectively, the problem we see is the rise of toxic masculinity. You see that in Trump, in Modi, in Bolsonaro, in Orbán, in all of these guys. And I think there is an issue for feminists to grapple with in how to reclaim this space. And I think that this is something that may have been left behind at a certain point, and we need to regain it. And so I think the threats are really about a rising toxic masculinity, which, by the way, I do think is linked to socioeconomic insecurity. I think as it turns out, when men are pitted against each other, it's not a good result. And so I think that the Scandinavian countries have really nailed that in a positive way, effectively realizing that the way to greater social security is through economic equality, more economic equality and security. And then I think that obviously the huge threat that we all face is in terms of climate change and the need to really try to collectively work on that. And so I think there is a conundrum in this states versus non-state actors and how to deal with these global challenges.
So that brings us back to the core question of, so if we agree that the climate change threat and the rising inequality are sort of the main challenges that we're facing, which there is sort of a growing global consensus on, not the total one, but there is a lot of consensus around that. So what role does can human rights play? Or can human rights play a role in addressing these issues? And that is in a way where our discussion is. Before I go back to you on that, I also want to say if you have any questions or comments or want to contribute, just raise your hand and I'll fit you in. Do you want to add something before giving?
No, I was just thinking when Lisa was speaking about cycles and stability. I think that is maybe one of the core dichotomies that we're facing now. Post-World War, we've had cycles of democratization, and now we're having a sort of a backlash against democracy. So there's like a if you think about it as linear or non-linear, you can think about politics going in the right direction for a while, and now it's kind of going in the wrong direction in many countries, if you think about respect for human rights. And at the same time, you've had an intensification and a strengthening of the international protection for human rights. But actually not only internationally, but also nationally. Courts and legislation and constitutions have become more pro-human rights in most countries. And yet you have this political backlash. So how do we explain that? And how do we explain backlashes against courts that are there to protect human rights?
I have a question there, but I also want to sort of latch on to, because some of the criticism would be that human rights are driving these processes of growing inequality, because human rights are a lot of different things, and that and that is sort of also part of this debate. But you can get the microphone.
Thank you for a really great discussion. It's been really interesting, and I was just wondering whether we are. I'm sorry if this question is quite incoherent, as I'm just kind of struggling with these issues myself. But to a certain extent, I agree that with the critique of human rights as insufficient in sort of the Samuel Moyn kind of way. But at the same time, you mentioned, for example, Lise Rakner, you mentioned the success of European law. And to me, I think that to a certain extent, the very undermining of human rights that you see today is to a certain extent a result of European law in the broad sense, as well as especially the international system of finance and regulatory power that international agencies have. Greve mentioned, for example, the restructuring of the Eastern European economies after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And as sort of a concrete example, the rise of peace is, to me at least, almost certainly a result of European legalization of certain aspects of Polish society, in the sense that, for example, the austerity imposed from 2000 and onwards, as well as the European Fiscal Compact of 2013 and restructuring of the labor market in 2005, all these things have just been creating more and more social inequality. And then we, to a certain extent, almost presented as if, and then the fascists came and they did the bad things. But PO banned public demonstrations already in 2013, which is a fundamental human right. So I think to a certain extent that we need to realize that the very core of the liberal center of public authority expressed through law and capitalism and flexible labor markets are making human rights insufficient in the way that they are, and that in order to fix the problem, one doesn't merely need to rethink human rights as such, but maybe even law as such, and how law contributes to creating the conditions for undermining other parts of law. And I was just hoping to hear your take on such a thought.
Thanks a lot.
That was wise comments. That's why I'm so happy we can have this seminar to have your thoughts about these things, because it's real challenges. And like you said, it's good for the courts to be rather slow, whereas the people are impatient. They are very impatient, and we don't want them to throw others out of the window as they wait for the courts to decide. We had a court case in the European Court of Human Rights. It was about the rights of a newborn child. That is, the child was now 20-something when the court had made its decision. So it took some time. And I believe in courts, otherwise I wouldn't be a judge myself. But even in Norway today, courts are becoming less relevant by the year. It's costly to have courts. We have always said that the state to refrain from certain things, that doesn't cost money. Of course it costs money. You need the courts, you need the police, you need. So every human rights come with a price tag. And I think the main challenge is this, that having worked on a high level when it comes to decision making, corruption is a phenomenon. I wouldn't say in the European Court of Human Rights, but on many levels high up in different systems. And I think, like a former Rafter Prize winner was saying, a peaceful individual makes a peaceful family, makes a peaceful village, or suburb, a peaceful then city, a peaceful nation, a peaceful continent, and a peaceful world. You can start on the top or you can start on the bottom. I think, unfortunately, on most issues, you have to ensure that people have the right moral character to be able to stand up for decision-making in such important issues as challenging over globe today. Because, unfortunately, also law is abused by the rich and the mighty to trample on others.
I just thought I wanted to echo Hanne Sophie and said I thought that was a really great comment, and because I think what you're saying is that these processes that we're seeing now, whether we want to call it backlash against democracy, insufficient, that we see courts, the European courts or any other court not sort of coming far enough, is because there are economic processes that have really sort of enhanced inequality. And well, I really want to talk more with Jackie about this later on. But I think it's just really an important reminder that this didn't start, with the elections in 2015 in Poland or with Orban, and it started long before. And at the risk of repeating myself, I think this is about lack of global governance. It is about lack of regulatory facilities that are actually sort of kind of when economic policies and companies and capitalism, whatever word you want to use, don't stop at national borders anymore. But a lot of our policies pretend that they do, and we don't really have any proper mechanism for policing this. We don't have any proper mechanism for making sure that global companies actually pay taxes, and we don't have any proper mechanisms for making sure that you don't shift your pollution around. And this is something, to me, this is when we need an expansion of the human rights discussion, and we have a starting point with where we have an acceptance that human rights are global, and we should expand that discussion. And it really, one more thing. What I really cherish is to have these kind of conversations. There may be lots of things that we actually thoroughly disagree on, and there should be more of this. And I don't know if any of you have seen this thing in Morgenbladet, where you can sign up for a global European dialogue. You put in your values, you put in your opinions on lots of issues, and then you are assigned over email with a person who disagrees with you. I think this is a wonderful. I've signed up. I'm really excited to see who my partner will be. It's probably going to be a super masculine, somebody who is against abortion and everything. And so, but this is something we need. We need to talk. We need to talk about the things that we disagree on. So I kind of just want to encourage you to either set up groups like that or to join this, because I think this is part of the problem, that we don't talk to each other.
So I really agree on the second. But I just want to sort of give some comment to the first one, because we actually have a lot of global governance. The problem is that, legal sociologists would remind us that law is frozen power, and the global governance that we have for companies reflect the power of the companies, and how, and that is, of course, the challenge. How do you get that sort of? How do you get law to change? How do we get the law to sort of reflect different power constellations? Is that possible? But But Jackie.
All right, so I think your question is absolutely key, and it links to what Siri was just saying. Law is about power, and law is a tool. It's not something in and of itself, and to the extent that it's frozen, or to the extent that it reflects certain interests, is a reflection of what we allow. And so I think the answer is all about mobilization. And I think we have to go back to that. And this is why when I started, I said I think we took it for granted that we were moving in a forward trajectory. And it turns out that we aren't. We have to go back to politics. That's the real problem as far as I'm concerned. Politics is broken, much more so than law. Basically we are reflecting at the moment a broken politics, and we need to go back to the grassroots. We need to go back to mobilizing and to organizing around the challenges of the day.
So Esmeralda, you need
Throw the ball.
just throw the catch ball.
I want that in my classroom.
Thanks for a wonderful discussion. I was interested in what Hanne Sophie said about the relevance of courts, also in Norway. And I was wondering whether there is some kind of responsibility there from the academia. I'm part of it. So my point is that, for example, in the climate change laws, the first and only one in Norway, there was this idea that we had to take a stance also in the academia, understanding whether courts were the place where to discuss these issues, right? The political question that maybe it's just up for the political branches to decide on climate change being so big a problem and global. But I realized that the whole discussion was still on very old dichotomies, as we were talking before, about the counter-majoritarian dilemma, the fact that judges are not elected, so maybe that's the easy way to understand whether the courts should be involved or not. They shouldn't. But how about that discussion? I think it's very old in the sense that even people that voted for the parties that approved the drilling in the Arctic cannot really have a voice in the parliament. They cannot talk to the ombudsman and have something changed, right? It's just advisory. It takes ages. And what about the timeline before the next election? And what about democracy? Is it just about that election and how people are gonna punish the parties that voted for that? So my point is, I think that debate spread from the academia to the judge in question. And the judge got into the subject matter. So he tried to look at whether things had been done okay. So the impact assessment and everything. But really, that was just on the surface. He didn't say, okay, there are mistakes. All other experts say that there are mistakes. The government acknowledges that. But we don't do anything about that because the parliament looked into that. But it's not enough, I believe, to look into something. Also for a judge, right? Where is judicial protection if I just look and I don't look closely, right? So I would like to have some kind of insights from you, given your experience and wisdom.
I cannot comment on that particular case, of course. But otherwise, I think that judges, like everyone else, are a party to society. And the more vigorous, in a positive sense, that the debate in academia, in society, is about every one issue, climate change not in the least, then judges will not be able to live in an ivory tower to the same extent as is possible today. That is why I think we really need to go back to have a public debate, general debate on all our challenges and be open. And as you said, I'm not so sure we are have that different opinions on everything, but even if we have, so let us try them out. Let's see how can we move forward. Of course, with the answers of the past, we don't meet the challenges of the future. The debate must be now and on what are the issues we are facing. And it should be broad, and it's easier for judges when they are confronted with so to speak, general issues on which they know that also society as such has an opinion, than for them to go back into their ivory tower and, if it is an ivory tower, but to sort of decide unilaterally. That is very difficult for a judge, because we are, after all, supposed to and would normally try to follow the law as such. And that, of course, is seen to be the legislative power is a democratic power. And when I speak about human rights, I normally want to add that it is within a context, rule of law, democracy, and human rights. These three are intertwined. But the broader the debate, the more positive. Academia has a very significant role to play.
So we have to stop. I want to give everyone a word at the end, but I want to just sort of, in a way, the question that Esmeralda asks is links to Jackie's comment about we need to go back to politics. So I think one of the questions is, can courts and rights have a role in sort of getting us back to politics in a constructive way? And I think that is also where a lot of legal theory is. So how can courts and law make politics work better and take sort of and concern themselves with the really important issues? Is there something that can happen in that way? And I think so that is my final words. I think this is something that we need to discuss more and have more conversations on. But I want to sort of go around, starting with Lisa and ending with Hanne Sophie, and then words of closing.
So I just think this should be the start. You know, we should have these conversations, and I think it's just really important, because there are so many things. What I sometimes worry about with the things that I study, because I do study threats to democracy. I do study politicians who pit groups against each other and who see short-term gains, in doing that, and which can have really long-term terrible repercussions. Because I think this is why this sort of kind of combination of law and politics, because politicians are incredibly short-sighted, and they are impatient, and they are concerned about surviving in the next election, and they do scary things, and they avoid many other much more difficult questions that cannot be solved in that discussion. For instance, like one of the things that we know we are not going to discuss in Norway ever is, whether we should rethink our relationship to the EU, for instance. So this is why I'm thinking we need to there are some processes where courts, law that take longer and have kind of a different agenda and a different time span. Sometimes, and where I do agree with you very much, this is a sort of counter-military the dilemma. Where is politics and where is law? But sometimes it is to our benefit to kind of give away some political rights, to put it into another debate. I think, but these questions are never easy. But I think, for just a very concrete example, the things that we don't talk about in Norway, in relation to us being a European nation, but still not being, and we don't talk about it because it doesn't fit any of the political parties to have a conversation about it. To me, I'm not saying where we should end in this discussion. I'm concerned that we don't have a discussion.
So I think, Esmeralda, your question is very, very key. And I think this is always going to be a question of timing, a question of context. And I can speak in the South African context where there's been a lot of debate about separation of powers and the role of courts. But what I think the courts did in South Africa over the 9 years when we had a really appalling president was actually to step up to the challenge and to say, look, maybe after 1994 and the democratic dispensation, we should have taken a step back because there was a democratic system in place, and maybe we should have been more deferential. But now we have a real threat to democracy in this president and to everything. And now we have to step over that line. And of course, there is no line per se. It is something that is negotiated, manufactured, and it's a dialectic. So I think it is important that courts actually do get into the fray when there are threats. I think it's very important that they don't just sit back on some, I don't know, 19th century or 18th century idea about what law is and its role. So it must respond.
Well, I agree that courts are important. We have seen a strengthening of courts in many countries over the last decades, actually. And I think one thing which is quite new, which we haven't talked about, but which may change the picture of courts as well, is the entry of women into courts. This is happening across the globe, and I don't think we know the concrete outcomes of that yet, how that may shape the judicial landscape in the next maybe 50 years. So I'm hopeful about courts. I'm maybe less hopeful about politics. But what I hear around this table is that deliberative democracy is maybe more important now than ever, that we actually talk about things, that we discuss values. And I want to come back again to something that you said, Hanne Sophie, which had to do with how do you build respect for human rights? And you said that you had to start with individual, and then you move to the community, and then to your region, and then to your country, and then to your... So it starts from the bottom. It's not only about how the state regulates or respects or doesn't respect human rights, and how courts treat human rights through the cases that, after all, have to be brought to the courts first. But it's also about how human beings respect each other. And I think maybe that's where we also have to have part of the discussion if we're going to have more human rights protection and more equality, into the future.
Thank you. It's a good start, and I think I'm optimistic. Generally speaking, I see many challenges, but I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic also because in many countries now, at least we start with people having an idea of who they are, that they have dignity, that they have worth, that they belong to a plurality, that they have to sort of communicate with that plurality, and that there is rights indeed, but also obligations. I think all the sort of conditions for starting good conversations among people, and it's among people we have to start, because people in power will normally not give it away voluntarily. I'm not suggesting that everything has to be taken away from them, but it should be argued that there should be limits to many things. And I think the most significant advice I can give you is start this conversation. And don't be tied up with what we answered in the past. Look at what are the options, what are the possibilities, where will it lead us? When we try to legislate the politicians, they always look at consequences. Maybe we should be more careful about looking at consequences when we discuss one human right as opposed to another. When we discuss human rights in a broader context, it's all linked together. And it's all about creating a condition that's beneficial to all of us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, all of you. Thank you, Anne-Sophie, for starting this conversation. And I want to also, while you're leaving now, I want to just say that, of course, we hope that we can continue some of that conversation here. And one of the things that we will be starting very soon is a seminar series on Bergen as a human rights city. Bergen, the City Council of Bergen decided in June, or before the summer, that Bergen would be a human rights city. And we need to have a conversation about what that means. And that is also this conversation. What does it mean in terms of equality and inequalities of different kinds? What does it mean? What does rights mean in this context? And we're going to have that series. We're planning it now together with the Rafta Foundation, and we're going to sort of also invite in other partners. And so that will be one possibility for continuing this conversation, and we'll invite you all back. So thank you for being here.
We will get another.